Yeah, cold nights I must confess, yeah. There's something in my soul that kept telling me to hold on. Even when the world turned its back on me, I knew deep inside that I wasn't meant to be bad.
Welcome to When I Was Homeless, a podcast that shares real stories of resilience and hope. I'm your host, Gabby Cunningham, and today we're having an honest conversation about homelessness, not as statistics, but as human experiences. Each story matters, each voice deserves to be heard, and each guest brings us closer to understanding. Today I'm joined by John, whose journey through homelessness is a powerful testament to strength and perseverance. His story sheds light on the challenges, the hope, and the humanity behind the experience. Let's dive in and learn from John's incredible journey. How are
I'm
you
very
doing?
glad to be here. Very glad.
So it's an honor to have you here. So how are you?
Uh, actually, yeah, I'm actually I have so many irons in the fire right now. I have to keep asking, where am I and who am I today? I'm working on two different sequels to the novel. So I've learned that I may be 76 years old, but I feel like I'm 36, and I've got a whole lifetime I have to get into the next schedule. So uh, I love this podcasting part of it right now, though. This is very exciting.
Okay, so let's take this back just a bit because I've been reading about your journey. I have to say, it's nothing short of remarkable, but for our listeners who may be having their first introduction to John, he has founded the Good Samaritan Home, and he has also published an award-winning novel, which I mentioned earlier. You've accomplished so much, but what really struck me is your belief that life is a marathon, not a sprint, and that it's never too late to change your life. That's such a powerful message. And here on When I Was Homeless, our mission is to share stories like yours because these stories remind us that homelessness is not an identity, it's an experience. Can you take us back to when your journey with homelessness specifically began?
Well, it's not something I anticipated because I never even crossed my mind that I would even be among what I consider to be the poor people. But I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and it was a very tumultuous time. I remember in elementary school that we were taught to jump under the desk to have a drill for a nuclear fallout in case there was a war. So we grew up with that sort of strange apocalyptic design. And then in the 60s, it seemed like we were living through that apocalypse with all the protests and the violence and the we daily we lived with this conflict in the news and in our neighborhoods and in the college campuses. So the downside is that the world economically was changing radically right at that time too. And I had grown up around the steel mills in Pittsburgh, where everybody, if you went to the mill or the factory, you could make a middle class living. You could support your family on it. But those jobs disappeared in the 70s because the mills closed down. And here I had been to college and I had really had no direction of where I was going after college. And I had a degree, so I was educated, but I wasn't prepared at all. So I found myself traveling around looking for something I thought I could do. And I ended up going from job to job to job. And some of the jobs were decent. For example, I was a fireman at one point, which is actually an excellent job for many people. But because I had no family structure, I ended up going on to what I felt to be the next great adventure. And so I ended up, the truth is, without a job and living in my truck. And then the truck was repossessed. And that's something I can't even begin to describe because the idea that your major concern on any given day, and at least when I had the truck, was where do I park so I can sleep for the night? And then when they repossess the truck, this feeling of you start looking around saying, where do I sleep tonight? because you start looking at the weather in terms of, can I find a safe place to get out of the rain? And the last thing on your mind is, how can I get a job? Because you're worried about where can you sleep. And it's a frightening thing for people who have grown up in an environment where work defines you. And when you don't have work, either through circumstance or bad choices, and you feel so helpless. That's the best way I can use to describe it, is I don't know what to do. I don't know where to turn. I don't know what's going to happen. And many times we don't have the network of community support when you keep moving, so you're all alone. So that to me was a frightening time. And I was fortunate in one respect. I met a girl who was very stable, and she looked beyond my current situation. And she said, I'd be more than happy to date you and have a relationship, but you got to get a job, cowboy. So I ended up driving a truck. And the downside to that is that when you feel like you could do better, so you're always looking for the next job and the next job. So even when I was married to her, I kept looking for something better. And that creates a great deal of instability. And here I was 20 years down the road, still living like I was single, not towards my wife and family, but towards my vocations. And at one point, I had tried. I was a building contractor. I was a journalist, and at one point, I was even a minister, thinking that if I could be a teacher in the church, I could create a great deal of stability for my family. But the truth was, I wasn't that good at it. And now, at 53 years old, I was without a job again, and we were going to lose our house again, and I was about to be homeless again. And I thought, this is the cycle coming back. What are we going to do? And that's when my wife and I decided to try to help people who are like us but have gone through similar situations by offering the temporary housing that we never had when I was single. And that's when we started Good Samaritan Home. And it changed my life by helping others in my position.
Thank you for sharing that. It's so important for our listeners to hear these experiences firsthand.
I've read an interesting story called, I can't think of her name right now. Bridges Out of Poverty, that's what it is. And it was written by a school administrator. And she talked about the clientele she dealt with in her school system and the different thinking that's in the poor class as opposed to the middle class. And we have a tendency to think that if we just tell somebody, get a job, that they'll suddenly turn around and go get that job and be middle class. But it's almost like saying, speak Spanish or speak Hungarian to someone who doesn't speak the language. And we don't have the tools. And I think that's what it comes down to. The reason I'm doing the work I do now with Good Samaritan Home, because I understand to a degree, I understand from my experience what the thinking is like when you're in survival mode. And somebody says, why don't you just do this? The truth is, we don't have the tools. We don't know the language. We don't know the first step. And that's, we like to think of it in terms of rehabilitation. But the truth is, for some of us, we're learning it for the first time. We're learning how to be habilitated. And that's why I have a great deal of sympathy for the people we deal with. Primarily, we work now with men and women coming out of prison because their homelessness is much more severe because they're dealing with legal issues they have to overcome. And they have a legal stigma based on their felony conviction. But I have found there's not a whole lot of separation between me and my residents, perhaps a degree or the extent of what they've done, but I do understand the feelings of helplessness that they often feel. And it's made me very sympathetic in dealing with people, even though I've never committed a felony myself.
When you started Good Samaritan Home, what led up to it? Because you also mentioned that you were in a pretty shaky space as well. So were there systems in place? Like what was the bridge from where you were to being able to help others?
I think there's a difference among the poor. There's more of a connection with one another. They will help one another more, I believe, because the poor tend to uh, get their support from associations. Whereas those of us who grew up in the working class, we thought we were better, I think, and we were able to do things on our own, particularly men. We don't ask for help. And the problem with not asking for help is you don't know where to go or what to do. And what made it worse for me, at least, was I had at least the appearance of an education. I had a degree which didn't qualify me for anything. I was educated, I guess you could say, but I was not equipped or prepared to be in the workforce. And worse than that was the idea that you still have a tendency to think that I don't need to do that menial work. I'm better than that. Or I can do more. I can earn more. And so we tend to lie to ourselves. And it wasn't until I reached what I felt to be my bottom where I said, yeah, there is no difference between me and the poor. I am poor. Uh, and the only way I can turn around is for me was by helping others. And it it made all the difference in my life because for the past 24 years we've been using Good Samaritan Home to help people restart their lives. So hopefully they wouldn't have to wait until they were 53 years old to start over like I did.
John, one thing that stands out about your story in particular is your resilience. And when you are in a situation where resilience is all that you have to rely on, for you, how did you pull that out? Was it your wife that helped you? What was that thing that kept you going?
My faith was obviously an integral part of it, but faith can often be, we can make it sound simplistic, uh, but faith can be very complex because we have a tendency to think if we pray for something, the answer will come immediately. But sometimes the answer is you just got to get out of bed and put your foot in front of the other. And I remember at one point, I was in construction. We had moved to another state with my family, and I could see there was no work, and I could see that we weren't going to make it. And so I called somebody in Texas that I had met, and I said, "Is there any work in Texas?" And he said, "There's plenty." So I loaded my truck, left my family in Kentucky where we were living, and I traveled 1,200 miles without anything other than a phone call. And we were thousands of dollars in debt, and we were on food stamps at the time, and that was something we never thought we would be faced with. And within 3 months, I had been able to save enough money with the working 7 days a week in Texas in construction. I was able to save enough money to pay back those debts, and within 4 months, I had moved my family down to be with me in Texas. So you like to think you can just fix something yourself, but you really do need to reach out to other people for help. And when I learned that lesson, it changed my life because I was able to literally start over again. And this was earlier on. I think I was 40 to 35 years old then, 35 years old then. And so I worked in Texas for many years in construction, trying to restart my life.
Mm, I think that's probably what you mean by your phrase that uh, failures that can develop calloused hands and tender hearts, right? Yeah. So, um, what do you wish more people understood about homelessness and the struggles that come with it?
I think we have a tendency to look at the people we see homeless on the street, particularly if they're living in sleeping. I saw this in New York, sleeping on the streets in New York, uh, and I think there's a tendency to see them as less than human, and absolutely less than us. And and the truth is that say when I drive to Lowe's or Walmart, you'll see somebody on the corner will work for food and such. And yes, there may be some people taking advantage of it, but if I can find an occasion where I can stop and not just give somebody some money, but ideally, what I would like to do is take them out to get something to eat so we can have a conversation, and that's very difficult sometimes. And I'm not saying I recommend it, but what I'm recommending is see them as human, see them as real people, and be less skeptical because particularly in this economy today where we've shifted from the factory middle class jobs to a service economy where you can work 20 and 30 hours, but you can't make a living wage and you can't provide for your family, and there's not the job security there once was. So it can be very unstable, particularly when you have a situation where we have single parent families, single mothers. It can be even more difficult for them. Uh, we've had single mothers in our shelter, and it's the most difficult time because they have to not just find work, but they have to find somebody to care for their children too. So it's an impossible pressure.
If you could go back and give advice to your younger self during these difficult times,
Right.
what advice would you give?
I think growing up where I did, I grew up by and large on my own because we were not a close family, and which was not uncommon in the 50s. Uh, but I would absolutely encourage me to seek out people when I was in high school to get direction instead of waiting until I was much older and had made so many mistakes. Find we call it a mentor now, but you just find somebody you can. In theory, it would be your father's role, but so often the father is absent or not involved. Uh, and so I think young men in particular need direction. And I will say this, that because of all my instabilities, I determined to be different with my children. And both of them have not only found stable work. My son's a police sergeant, and my daughter is an executive with Enterprise Rent-A-Car. And they both have been in the same house for 20 years, been at the same job for 25 years, and they have started at the place where I wish I had started when I was their age. So maybe what I did was what I'd hoped somebody would have done for me, was get me started on the right foot. So in that respect, I feel like there's been something positive coming out of my mistakes. I haven't repeated them with my children. I've allowed them to be different.
Um, and also, you accomplished so much in addition to being an incredible father. Your
Right.
work has had profound impact in the home and then outside of the home. How has your experience with homelessness shaped the way that you approach your work with the unhoused right now?
I have 10 staff now. When we started Good Samaritan Home, it was we was in our own home. The only thing we could afford was the oldest house in town, and I remodeled it while we lived in it, and we used it as a shelter. But over time, we were able to become a contractor with the state of Ohio to offer housing for men and women coming from prison, because the state found it was cheaper to house somebody in a not a shelter like ours, but we call it independent housing, where it's a mentoring house, because it's much, much cheaper than it is to put somebody in prison for $109 a day. So it's economically it's beneficial, but also people coming from prison, if they're in community, they can earn a living, they can pay their child support, they can pay taxes, they can become taxpayers instead of tax burdens. But the hardest thing that I do is I'm now the director of Good Samaritan Home, and what I try to teach my staff is that I have been homeless. I know what these men and women feel. And let's suppose they do something that is disruptive in our house, or they break a rule. Staff may want to just say, let's terminate them, let's put them out. But I always remember that I have been in that position where I've made mistakes. I've said things I shouldn't have because I was scared or angry, or I just wasn't thinking. And I tell my staff, let's give them a second chance, give them a third chance, because homelessness in January could be a death sentence. And I've had people come to me with their feet nearly frozen, where they had to go to the hospital before they can come to our house. So we have rules, we have guidelines we have to follow, but we also are primarily molded by mercy, a second, third, or fourth chance, particularly when we're dealing with people who are addicted. It takes several failures to find that one success they're looking for. So I work very hard with my staff at trying to pass on that sense of compassion that I've learned through my own mistakes. And my staff sometimes gets frustrated with me because they know what I'm going to do, but I also know that they end up modeling me in some way. So I think I'm able to pass that on to them. And that means Good Samaritan Home will survive me. And that's what matters.
I love your lead with love approach. In addition to being a nonprofit founder and director, you've also written this book. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about the book and running as fast as I can? What inspired you to write it?
Yeah.
And possibly even what message would you like readers to take away from it?
I always wanted to write a book. I started writing when I was 25, and I realized I had nothing to say at that point in my life. So I put it away and just kept writing journal notes as I went through all these struggles. And then when I reached 65, I said, now's the time. But I don't want to just write facts and figures. I don't want to preach a sermon. I don't want to point fingers at somebody and give them an academic treatise. So the best example I can give is if I were to tell you we're going to have a lecture on lifeboat safety, nobody would hear me. But if I showed you the movie Titanic and you watched Jack and Rose try to survive the sinking of the Titanic, you would be very, very aware on your next cruise ship where the lifeboats are, because the lesson was conveyed through an emotional story. So what I tried to do with Daniel Robinson was portray somebody like me, or perhaps like you, who grew up in a situation where they were disconnected, and then through circumstances or bad choices, they went down a rabbit hole of mistakes. And the trouble is with some of us, we don't know how to get out of that rabbit hole, and we keep floundering and falling backwards again. And the sad part is that we're running as fast as we can. We're doing the best we can. We just don't know what else to do. And there are some people who seem to they start off at 12 and they're getting awards. At 20, they're getting college degrees. At 25, they're making high dollar salaries. They seem to have everything so easily. For them, life is a sprint. But I think that I'm actually more common. I've made a lot of mistakes. I've made a lot of do-overs. And for me, life is a marathon. And I was 50 years reaching my goal. So I see life as a marathon. So if I were to give advice to anybody, I would say, don't to compare yourself to the sprinters. Think of the long distance runner, and you just keep running, because in the end, you still will get there. Just pace yourself and do the best you can and keep running. That's what I would advise people.
John, before we wrap up, I'd love for you to share more about what other projects you're working on. You mentioned Second Chance Careers. We know about your nonprofit, and maybe you could give us information on, you know, how we can help your nonprofit. And of course, your novel, like that's already out. You maybe want to share how we can find that. It sounds like a great book.
And what happened was, as somebody would say, particularly men, they say, well, Daniel, he shouldn't have done that. He came across as so emotional, so weak. And that's my point, is that men are emotional. We just don't allow ourselves to share it. And Daniel made a lot of mistakes. And when he finally did things right, that was no guarantee that he would live happily forever, because life isn't that way. But the question is, do you learn from it? And in the end, are you better because of all your journeys? And so what I'm finding with people is they're writing to me saying, I saw myself in that story. I couldn't put the book down because I kept saying, Daniel, don't do that. And I knew he would do it just like I did. And so readers are identifying with the story. But the most important thing, Gabby, is that we're talking about second chances. It's not about my novel. It's not about making sales. It's about making conversations. I'm hoping that we never do what Nancy Reagan did in 1980 when she said, we just need to say no to drugs, as if that's a simple answer. It takes failure after failure, 7 times in rehab on average, to overcome a drug addiction. So why should we be less forgiving with somebody who has an emotional addiction? We need to forgive one another, and we need to be always looking for that second and third and fourth chance in others as well as ourselves. And that's why I wrote that book, Running as Fast as I Can, to encourage people to keep running. And that's why we're doing these podcasts now, to talk about second chances. And so maybe I can help somebody else who's struggling like I did.
John, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. Thank you for giving your insight.
Gabby, let me add one afterthought. In our reentry program, it's for homeless people coming from prison. 98% of them are men. We have helped 2,500 men and women over the past 24 years. But from my world, at least, there are far, far more homeless men coming out of prison than there are women.
Oh, wow, that actually makes a lot of sense.
Well, I like to say that if somebody's a taxpayer, everybody wins, because when you're a tax burden, we all pay for it somewhere. So helping somebody get a job should make the Republicans and the Democrats happy.
Oh, no, you didn't bring in the red and the blue. This was such a good combo.
Oh, well, I will tell you, though, it's fear often is why people react the way they do. But when they get to know somebody, we had critics who were opposed to our program until we actually went around to use the snowblower to clean the streets of everybody on the block. And then they realized that we were people too. We were neighbors. We were not those people.
Thank you, John, for sharing your story with us today. Your journey is a powerful reminder of the resilience. Your journey is a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. To our listeners, remember that homelessness is not an identity. It's an experience that can happen to anyone. If you'd like to learn more or find ways to get involved, please visit formybonuschild.org. Until next time, this is Gabby Cunningham, reminding you that every story matters, including yours.